Right, chapter 4. Now I've deleted I've deleted everything, so I should have room to read this one. It's a long one. Hey. So it's either Weird, Word, or Wired. I think it's Weird. That's what I'm going to say. We have to admit that our ancestors were heathen when they first came to Britain. But having been conditioned by 1300 years of Christianity, we are apt to forget that even heathens have gods, together with some description of how the world began, how man was created and what happens to him after death. Many heathen mythologies go on to relate how the world itself will end. There are reasons for believing that Anglo-Saxon mythology made mention of all these things. So far as they accept a god or gods and a mythology, the present-day descendants of the Anglo-Saxons have borrowed from the Jews. The Jews came to be uncompromising believers in one God. They were monotheists. Our own ancestors were polytheists, believing in a number of gods, a family of them, with father and mother, sons and daughters. One may suspect that there is still more than a trace of polytheism in the beliefs of the modern English Christian. Old racial habits of thought die hard, and especially the Roman Catholic Christian. For the pantheon includes God the Father, God the Son, the Holy Ghost, the Divine Mother, and any number of wonder-working saints. The formal conversion of the English to Christianity began when Augustine landed in Thanet a little more than 100 years after the first Anglo-Saxons and Jutes had begun to settle here. Augustine's mission to convert them started in the year AD 597. At this time, the English formed an island outpost of heathendom, for they were practically surrounded by Christian peoples in the Celts of Cornwall, Wales, Ireland and Scotland, and the Franks across the Channel. When the heathen king of Kent, Ethelbert, heard of Augustine's landing with some 40 companions, he sent orders for them not to move off Thanet. King Ethelbert himself may be said to have had his right foot planted firmly on the straight and narrow path already, since for 9 years he had been married to Bertha, a daughter of Charibert of Paris and a Christian. Bertha's marriage contract had stipulated that she be allowed to remain a practising Christian and to have with her in Ethelbert's court Bishop Liudhard of the Franks. It is perhaps obvious that no man could have Christianity in bed and at breakfast for 9 years without being affected. Nevertheless, according to what appears to be a genuine tradition, King Ethelbert consented to meet the stranger monks only under the open sky because he was afraid of their magic. Or should we say, he wished to meet them in the presence of the old Sky Father. Whatever it was, he was soon convinced that they were not magicians and gave the missionaries his support. And who could have been more surprised than the tonsured father who had led his procession of singing followers to greet the king? Ethelbert seated in a chair, and they walking behind a raised silver cross and a likeness of the Saviour painted on a board. For Augustine had turned back once in his mission, having been frightened by gossip of the barbarous practices of the fierce English. Instead of barbarity, King Ethelbert gave Augustine supplies, a dwelling in Canterbury, and permission to preach. He himself was baptized, his lead being followed by his thanes and ordinary subjects, so that Augustine could claim that 10,000 men of Kent had been baptized by the end of the first year of his mission. Christianity spread to the other kingdoms of Anglo-Saxon England, to Northumbria, to Mercia, to Wessex, and in spite of backslidings and fairly frequent returns to paganism by influential kings, the country could claim to be Christian by the time of the Synod of Whitby in the year 664. In those days, society knew nothing of a closed shop as stringent as any modern one, with every man, from the king downwards, filling his appointed place and doing his ordained task, not at the behest of a shop steward, but, in the heathen period, of Wyrd or destiny, and in Christian times of God himself. With the institution of a new class of society, namely the Christian priests and bishops, whose business was with words and ideas, there grew up a new trade, that of books. This new trade of written literature remained for centuries in the hands of priests and their adherents, and wholly under the jurisdiction of the Church. Formerly, the heathen Angles, Saxons and Jutes had cultivated a flourishing pagan spoken literature, which depended for its life and growth on a well-defined alliterative verse form, easier than prose to memorize, and on gleemen and scops, wandering minstrels or poets attached to the household of a great man, having prodigious memories as well as creative powers of their own. But the poets were the one exception to every man to his trade. They might well hand the harp to their nearest lay neighbour at the festive board to continue singing, while they themselves quaffed beer or mead to slake their fiery throats. It is not easy for us, after some years of compulsory education, free libraries, cheap newspapers, and latterly cinema, radio, and television, to imagine a people whose memories were muscular, supple in training, and therefore quick to learn, capacious and extraordinarily retentive. At the turn of the 6th century in England, it was the mark of the magician to be able to write, for writing meant the cutting or scratching of runes on stone, bone or metal, and the purpose of rune wristing was more often than not to do with soothsaying or sorcery. But our illiterate ancestors did have codes of law. They did have histories, sagas and myths, which, like their mile-long family trees, were passed from ear to tongue, from one generation to another, often in rhythmical form to give the memory at least a little support. The curse of modern society is that it has a high mortality rate in poets. They get mashed up in the machinery. The Old English, on the other hand, held poets in high esteem, with priests and kings. Great respect was paid to the art of finding sayings rightly bound, that is, in alliterative verse, and it was a matter of at least for private shame to have to leave the feast, as Caedmon at first was wont to do, before the glee would, the harp passing from hand to hand, reached you because you were unable to sing. Kings as well as commoners sang. We are told in Beowulf that Hrothgar, lord of the Danes, the glee wood touched, the harp's sweet note awoke, and now a song intoned, both soothed and sad. Now the great-hearted king told a wondrous tale. The aristocracy, kings and thanes, maintained shapers or makers of verse, for that is what scop stands for, at their courts, while the gleeman or gleeman wandered far and wide among men with his harp. In fact, one of the earliest poems is called Wyrd, the Far Traveller, from its maker, who tells how he visited all the northwest European and other people of the continent, not to mention the Medes, Persians and Jews. Of course, Wyrd is not the record of the actual wanderings of a glee gentleman, a real gentleman. A minstrel who claimed to have been at the court of Ermanric, who died AD 375, could not have been in Italy with Alfwine, who invaded this country in 568. Wyrd the poem is a glorification of the class to which Wyrd the poet belonged. I think this is a little bit of it. Thus wandering, the minstrels travel as chance will have it, through the lands of many different peoples. Always they are bound to come across, in the north or the south, some person who is touched by their song and is generous with his gifts, who will increase his reputation in front of his henchmen, showing his nobility of spirit before worldly things pass away. The light and the life. He who works for his own good name will be rewarded on earth by a strong and steady fame. The situation is admirably summed up by Bernhard Tenbrink, who says, "Herein lies the essential difference between that age and our own. The result of poetical activity was not the property and not the production of a single person, but of the community. The work of the individual singer endured only as long as its delivery lasted. He gained personal distinction only as a virtuoso. The permanent elements of what he presented, the material, the ideas, even the style and metre, already existed. The work of the singer was only a ripple in the stream of national poetry. Who could say how much the individual contributed to it, or where in his poetical recitation memory ceased and creative impulse began? In any case, the work of the individual lived on only as the ideal possession of the aggregate body of the people, and it soon lost the stamp of originality." What is important for us to realise is that while minstrels continued down the ages to wander and sing, the subject of which they treated could not be forgotten or entirely stamped out by proselytising clerics. And as regards the subject matter, if we are to judge from the literary relics of the blood relations of the Old English, that is to say, from the literature of the ancient Scandinavian peoples and even farther back, from the works of others of the Indo-European knot of peoples, of the Hindus, Greeks and Romans, then two subjects were exploited, gods and heroes. After the English were converted, Christian poets still sang about gods and heroes, but, as frequently happens in such cases, the gods of the old religion became the devils of the new, while Jesus Christ is referred to as the young hero, as in the Anglo-Saxon poem called The Dream of the Wyrd. But the broader effort is for the old gods to be dropped almost completely from the new written literature. Their names are suppressed, though, as I shall suggest, their stories sometimes live on in Christian setting. Like ancient ruins which tease the curiosity of the beholder, or like fossils, the remains of these deities still lie about us. As we have seen, they survive in place names, or they live on in the one spot calculated to escape our notice, that is to say, under our very noses, in the names of the days of the week, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday and Friday. Or again, both pagan deities and myths are remembered in folklore and fairy tale, with their stories of Wayland Smith, witches on broomsticks, and the wild rider, who is really Woden in disguise. Or yet again in works of art like the Frank's casket already described, or in pictured plaques on helmets, or the decoration of shoulder clasps, buckles and purse tops, such as those dug up at Sutton Hoo. Much as we have suffered from the conscious effort to suppress the old mythology in literature, our loss was made the greater at the time of the Reformation in England, when hundreds and thousands of books and manuscripts were lost or destroyed on the libraries of abbeys and monasteries, being flung out of doors. John Bale, in his preface to Leland's laborious journey, printed at London in 1549, says that those who bought the monasteries reserved the books, some to scour their candlesticks, some to scrub their boots, some for even more ignoble uses, some they sold to the grocers and soap sellers, and some they sent overseas to the bookbinders, not in small numbers, but at times whole ships full, to the wonderment of foreign nations. That John Bale was not exaggerating is suggested first by the fact most of such Anglo-Saxon poetry has survived, is contained in only 4 manuscript books, and secondly by the circumstances, already remarked on, of the accidental discovery in Denmark of a fragment of the Anglo-Saxon epic known as Wyrd. It happened like this. On January the 12th, 1860, Professor E.C. Werlauf, chief librarian at the National Library, Copenhagen, was engaged in sorting some bundles of papers, parchment leaves and fragments, mostly taken from books or book backs, which had not hitherto been arranged. While thus occupied, he lighted upon 2 vellum leaves of great antiquity, and bearing an old English text. How are the mighty fallen? 60 lines. This is all that was left of Wyrd, an epic originally, we may suspect, as long as Beowulf, which contains over 3,000 lines or more words than a Shakespearean play. One result of such losses is that to attempt a reconstruction of the ancient English mythology is to engage in a piece of detective work whose clues lie far scattered, often hidden and liable to suggest conclusions which at best are tentative and may never be capable of proof. But the chase need not be dull, and on the contrary may be exciting. Take the Anglo-Saxon poem just mentioned, Beowulf. This is a tale of a warrior prince who, in his full youth and vigour, wrestled with an ape-like monster, who for years had been lugging off by night 10 or 20 at a time the retainers of the Danish king Hrothgar. Young Beowulf sailed from Sweden to Denmark, and in the blackness of Hrothgar's sleeping hall awaited the coming of the ogre Grendel from the gloomy moor. When the monster broke in, the warrior grappled with him. Then the chairs and benches in the hall were overturned and smashed to flinders. Grendel quickly understood that for the first time in his life he had met his match, and he tried to drag his opponent to the hall door. Beowulf grimly held back, and when at last the monster succeeded in breaking out into the fading starlight, he finally wrenched with such a panic that his massive arm was torn like a molar from its body and left in Beowulf's grasp. The doomed Grendel staggered off to the moor, leaving in the morning twilight a wet black trail behind him. The poem goes on to relate the vengeance of Grendel's mother, an ogress, and how after diving down into the sinkhole of a lonely and fearsome tarn, Beowulf killed her in an underground cave. In his later life, Beowulf became king of his people, and in saving them from the attacks of a fire-breathing dragon was himself destroyed. His grateful subjects burnt his body on a pyre, later heaping a huge mound of stones and earth over the ashes. So the Old English Hall are seen in the barn at Godmersham, Kent. So there's a picture. Built about 1486, it embodies principles which have been in use from Anglo-Saxon times. The great hall haircot in Beowulf was constructed in this fashion. Down its centre the long fire burned, and the warriors sat and feasted. There are still many similar barns to be seen up and down England. Barn. It is quite by chance that the wonderful old epic has escaped the fate of Wyrd, or worse, for having evaded the ravages of time and the tearing up wholesale of libraries at the dissolution of the monasteries. The unique manuscript came within a whiff of destruction when Ashburnham House caught fire in 1731. At the time, Beowulf formed part of the library of Sir Thomas Cotton, and its vellum pages were near enough to cinders for some of the edges to be scorched and make brittle, so that they have chipped away. And with the lost fragments, part of the text has gone too. About the end of the 18th century, Thorkelin, an Icelander, came to England, copied the manuscript himself, and caused another copy to be made. He spent years preparing an edition, only to have his translation and notes annihilated, of all people Admiral Nelson. For most of Thorkelin's material went up in smoke when the English bombarded Copenhagen in 1807. But the copy of Beowulf did escape, and the Icelander's edition appeared at least in 1815. The 3,000 lines of alliterating verse which go to make up Beowulf were being composed in the north of England about AD 650. That is to say, at the time when the conversion of the English to Christianity was hardly complete. It was, in fact, barely 200 years since the first colonising Anglo-Saxon and Jutes had set foot in Britain. But while the conscious intention of the poem is Christian, God being mentioned on average every 60 lines or so, the remarkable fact is that setting is quite pagan and foreign, and none of the characters is English. There is reliable history in Beowulf, but it is not English history. It is the memory of people who lived and events which took place on the continent, the background being Denmark and the southern parts of the Scandinavian peninsula. Some of the continental history is presented in fairly involved detail. If it could be remembered and recorded a couple of hundred years after it had taken place, then it is obvious that, had he wanted to do so, the Beowulf poet could far more easily have recorded the pagan myths unrecently supplanted by Christianity. That he did not must be regarded as a deliberate act. Nevertheless, the poet could not entirely suppress all pagan folk memory, and unwittingly he left a number of clues to the old mythology scattered throughout his poem. We may start with a clue to a fundamental idea not only of Old English mythology, but of Indo-European myth generally. This idea is that an all-powerful fate or destiny. The name of this fate in Old English is Wyrd, or Weird, or Wyrd, who was originally pictured as a woman, a dread omnipotent personality to whom even the gods were subject. The word Wyrd occurs 9 times in Beowulf, with the meaning omnipotent fate or destiny. How long have we got to go? Loads. Oh, crikey. Oh God, so much. But there is confusion in the mind of the poet, for he accepts elsewhere in his poem the omnipotence of the Christian God too. Two omnipotent powers cannot exist together, so the line of development is clear. One or other must give up its position. Such a move may be effected in 2 ways. Either God or Wyrd will be effaced and forgotten, or, since the Christian religion is gaining the upper hand at this time, before long God and Wyrd will be identified with each other, Wyrd becoming an attribute of God, his providence. This is actually what did take place, but for some time during the transition period, Wyrd is remembered in Old English writings as all-powerful, with the Christian God himself subject to her power. In spite of what modern writers such as Miss Dorothy Whitelock would have us believe, this truly remarkable state of affairs must be inferred from, for instance, some of the earliest Anglo-Saxon verse, such as the Gnomic poems and A Dream of the Road. The Gnomic poems show verse in a very early form. They consist of sententious sayings, which often appear to be unrelated to each other. But when we find 2 such statements as the following occurring in one breath, the glories of Christ are great, Wyrd is strongest of all, one can only conclude that the poet was remembering his old myths. This is not an isolated instance. It is repeated even more graphically in The Road. At the crucifixion, after describing Christ's hanging on the cross and his wounding with nails, the Rood says, "I was dripping with bloodshed from the man's side after he had given up the ghost, and most significantly, immediately afterwards, I have endured many terrible Wyrds upon the hill." And there's some foreign. Modern translators usually rendered the word Wyrds as trials or experiences, but when it comes, as it does, immediately on the mention of Christ's death, it is reasonable to suppose that the poet was remembering the old power yielded by Wyrd over the gods. A similar example is repeated at line 72 of the Rood. It's not road, it's Rood. Rood. Dream of the Rood. The corpse grew cold, that fair house of the soul. Then men began to fell us to the ground. That was a terrible Wyrd. The unique manuscript of the Dream of the Rood is comparatively late, being dated about AD 1000. Part of the poem itself, from line 78 onwards, appears to have been added around about that time, but the rest is much earlier. We have certain proof of this from having found quotations from it cut in runes on the celebrated cross at Ruthwell in Dumfriesshire, and the Ruthwell cross is judged by most recent authorities to have been carved about the year AD 700, so that the Dream of the Rood must be also as old as Beowulf. It is from the original part of the Rood that the evidence I have given above is drawn. Nevertheless, the uncertainty with which our ancestors thought about Wyrd in the transition period before she became God's providence is reflected in another quotation from Beowulf, a quotation which, even as it tends to identify Wyrd with the Christian God, remembers most clearly the pagan goddess spinning the thread of life. I am thinking of the line 696 of Beowulf, where we read, "The Lord gave the people of the Weeders web to speed them to their battles." To the uninitiated, this sentence is almost without meaning, even when we realise that webs are woven cloths. The meaning would have been obvious if, for instance, the sentence had run, "The Lord gave the people of the Weeders better bows and arrows to speed them in their battles." The explanation of the original is that the poet has made a metaphor from the old pagan conception of Wyrd as fate. Wyrd was originally one of three sisters, the Fatal Sisters, who were concerned with the spinning of a thread or a weaving of a cloth which represented the lives of men. Oh, I've heard of that. In this case, the Beowulf poet has given a pale cast of Christianity to a purely heathen thought by imagining God as the weaver. A couple of centuries after this, Christian men no longer regarded God as being subject to Wyrd. The wheel has turned full cycle, and Wyrd is identified with or subject to God as regarded as one of his attributes. For King Alfred the Great, writing about the year 888, says in his translation of Boethius, Boethius, "What we call Wyrd is really the work of God, about which he is busy every day." And there's a bit foreign, might be Greek, don't know. Miss Dorothy Whitelock, in The Beginnings of English Society, is convinced that though there are Old English references where some degree of personification of fate is present, I think this is a quote now, such as the creation of the fates changes the world under the heavens, or woven by the decrees of fate. Nevertheless, she doubts if these are more than figures of speech by the times the poems were composed. If they are inherited from a heathen past, they may indicate that men then believed in a goddess who wove their destiny. But the poet who says, "To him the Lord granted the webs of victory," is unconscious of a heathen implication in his phrase. Such phrases as Miss Whitelock quotes may have become cliches by the time we meet them, but this development does not invalidate the contention that our ancestors did once believe in a fate who wove their destinies. The same words connected with both weaving and destiny or fortune make it certain that the Old English had believed in such a dread personage. Take, for example, the Old English phrase, "me that weird something or another, gwyrth," which means fate wove me that destiny, and compare the word GEW. It's one of those like O and E's that are like glued together. F. I bet you wish Mark was reading this now, he'd probably know what that was called. But he's still in bed, so you've got, you know, he pays your money, he takes your chances. But you don't pay anybody money. Yeah. So it's that. Can you see that? Because I don't know what that O and E is called when it's glued together. You probably can't see it, can you? I can't see. Oh, I don't know. I'll be back. Gwaith, let's just call it that. The word gwaith, wove with its cognate gewith, meaning fortune, or Eaden and Ead, wealth, riches, fortunes. The basic sense of which appears in the related Lithuanian word ordme, I weave. In actual fact, the idea of Wyrd as one of three sisters who weave men's fate is kept alive long after the conversion to Christianity. In written works, we still bloody it's a long one, isn't it? In written works of the Old English period, the thought of Wyrd as a goddess was consciously played down by monkish writers and copyists. I need a drink. Hold on. I'm sitting so uncomfortably. I've come up with a few good ideas myself whilst I've been reading this about ideas what to do. I'll get our Marky Mark on board. It really feels like autumn's coming. I like it. I get so inspired in the autumn. Where do we get to? Right. So in written works of the Old English, my back, Old English period, the thought of Wyrd as a goddess was consciously played down by monkish writers and copyists. That is why such phrases as those quoted above have tended to become meaningless cliches. But the idea of the three pagan fates lived long in oral tradition, for centuries in fact, until it exploded into most dramatic representation in 1605 in the three Wyrd sisters. Now he spelt it like you probably call me. Weird. Of Shakespeare's Macbeth. I'm having a bit of a deja vu, just a little one. That this was no isolated flight or fancy, nor even a refurbishment of classical myth by one who knew a little Latin, if less Greek, is indicated by other references over the years, intervening between Ethelbert of Kent and Elizabeth of England. For instance, the Latin name of the three fates, Parcae, P-A-R-C-A-E, appears as Wyrd, W-Y-R-D-E, in the Corpus Gloss about AD 725. Then about 1385, Chaucer, in the Legend of Good Women, is writing of the words, W-E-R-D-Y-S, the words that were clandestine. And about 1450, in the Court of Love, we read, I many the three of fatale destine that be our wordes, W-E-R-D-E-S. Quite the fluent French person, mate. And so on to Macbeth. It would be perverse not to believe that what Shakespeare wrote was the flowering of a seed perennial in the folk mind. But it is instructive to observe that according to the New English Dictionary, the word Wyrd, W-Y-R-D, a little quote now, is common in Old English but wanting in Middle English until 1300, then occurs chiefly in northern texts, though employed by Chaucer, Gower and Langland. It now becomes apparent that after the development noted in Alfred Boethius, when Wyrd had been made subject to the Christian God, the Church, controlling literature, suppressed the pagan word in writing as well as the idea. That both word and idea only went underground, or would faded into thin air, be a better metaphor. and lived on secretly upon the lips of gleemen and the laity is proved by their reappearance in the secular literature of the later Middle Ages after 300 years of being unrecorded. How, over such a long period, had the pagan conception submitted to alteration? A study of what Shakespeare has to say on the subject will soon tell us. He portrays three witches who are referred to in Macbeth's letter to his wife as Wyrd sisters. These sisters foretell the future and are able to influence what is come to pass. They are dreadful in aspect and connected with darkness. How now, you secret black and midnight hags! They work their spells in a cavern about a circular cauldron. They seem to be concerned with battles, for the opening words of Macbeth run, first witch, when shall we three meet again, in thunder, lightning, or in rain? Second witch, when the hurly-burly's done, when the battle's lost and won. Here, in fact, we have all except one of the main attributes of the ancient Indo-European fates, together with the addition of what appears to be purely Northwest European development, namely, the belief that the three sisters were specially concerned to give defeat or victory in battle. This was what the Beowulf poet was remembering when he said, "The Lord gave the people of the Weders, W-E-D-E-R, Weders webs to speed them in their battles." But apart from the ideas of the omnipotence of Wyrd over the destinies of gods and men, and the memory of her power to influence the course of battle, our Old English literature does not record the Indo-European conceptions revived in Macbeth. Yet we must believe that the pagan Anglo-Saxons knew these conceptions, partly because of the clues in Old English literature already discussed, partly because of their reappearance in English literature as late as the 16th century, and partly because we find them recorded in the literature of a closely related people, the Icelanders. Long after the English had become Christians, still recording, the Icelanders were still writing down the ancient pagan beliefs about the fates. The people of Iceland called Wyrd by the name Urdr, U-R-D-R. A sound change peculiar to the Norse peoples had resulted in initial W being lost from certain words, of which Urdr is an example. In Old Saxon she is Wyrd, and in Old High German Wirt. All these forms of the name derive from the same word, an ancient verb meaning to become, which we still find fossilised in such archaic English phrases as woe-worth. The Icelanders called Urdr's two sisters Verdandi and Skald. These three names together being equivalent to past, present and future. God, do you know, it's so weird. I've been thinking about reading my book on the tarot out, basically, because it's interesting for you, but also so get it in my head. And that's like one of the things you do in tarot, past, present and future. One of the things. I don't know, it's just all, and it's just literally there. I don't know. I think there's something going on here. For me personally, there's something going on. I don't know what it is. It feels weird. And I just had a deja vu. Reading this, something's going on in me. Something's being ignited. I feel like, this sounds a bit weird, but it's fine. I feel like some embers are starting to ignite within me just reading this. I don't know. Weird. I'm weird. Alright. I just feel a bit, I feel a bit, what's the word? Oh, bloody hell. What's the word? I feel weird. I do. Okay. So the sisters, past, present and future. Collectively, the sisters were known as the Nornir, and were said to dwell in heaven by the side of a well over which stands one of the massive roots of the mighty Wyrd ash tree called Yggdrasil. Every day the Norns took water from the well and, mixing it with clay from the banks, pasted the ash tree root to prevent its limbs from withering or rotting. For according to the Icelandic storyteller, the water of the well of Wyrd is so holy that all things which dip into it become as white as a film which shines within the shell of an egg. Well, I've just done that funny little, I think it's funny, little fit. I'm doing my God's down to earth funny little things. And I did one on Odin, and that was about the well underneath the Yggdrasil tree, which is guarded by Mimir, Memir, and that's how he lost his eye, because he had to throw his eye into that well to get the knowledge. And so they're talking about these three sisters kind of guarding that well, sort of thing. This is weird. We may return for a few moments to the Elizabethan traditions about the Wyrd sisters to record a significant connection between them also and a tree which, as far as I am aware, has not been noticed before. Shakespeare used as a source for the three sisters Holinshed's Chronicles, where we read, "It fortuned as Macbeth and Banquo ironed towards fours." No idea. "While the king then lie, they went sporting by the way, together without other company, so onnily themselves passing through the woods and fields, when suddenly in the midst of the land there met them three women in strange and wild apparel, resembling creatures of elder world, whom when they attenually beheld, wondering much at the sight, the first of them spake and said, All hail Macbeth, Thane of Glamis, for he had lately entered into that dignity and office by the death of his father Sinel. The second of them said, Hail Macbeth, Thane of Cawdor, but the third said, All hail Macbeth, that hereafter shall be King of Scotland." So there's the Wyrd sisters. Can you see that? Probably not. I don't know if you can see that or not. Bloody hell, it's a long one, isn't it? How much more we got to go? Oh, crikey. Oh, not too bad. Now, on page 243 of the first edition of Holinshed's Chronicles, there is a woodcut of this episode. I think that's what I've just shown you. Yeah. But as Dover Wilson says in his edition in Macbeth, it is certainly noteworthy that the draftsman dresses the sisters as great Elizabethan ladies and represents the scene as a barren heath, ignoring Holinshed's express words in both particulars. This suggests that the artist knew of an independent tradition concerning the Wyrd sisters, a tradition which also included a tree. For the very centrepiece of his otherwise blasted heath is a huge and flourishing tree. See it? By which the sisters stand. Is it too much to suppose that here is a memory of Yggdrasil? I find it difficult to say that word, Yggdrasil. Holinshed himself is speaking of personages who are more than the poor old human hags regarded as witches, as we may gather from his phrase, creatures of elder world, where elder means the same as eldritch, that is, weird or ghostly. Indeed, he later supposes they might have been the goddesses of destiny, and their connection with past, present and future is expressly emphasized with one sister speaking of what has already happened, the sound of what is present, though unknown to Macbeth, and the third with what is to come. It is certain, not only from the mention of webs in Beowulf, but also from the Greek parallel of the Moirai or Fates, that Urda, that is to say our Wyrd, and her sisters were originally thought of as spinners. The names of the Greek Fates were Clotho, who spun, Lachesis, who measured the thread, and Atropos, who snapped or cut the thread and so ended man's life. According to the old view, the Moirai were the daughters of night. They lived in heaven in a cave by a pool whose white water gushed from the cave. This, says Kerenyi, is the gods of the Greeks, is a clear image of moonlight. The name Warrior means part and their number, so the Orpheus claim correspond to the parts of the moon, and that is why Orpheus sings of the Moirai in white raiment. The Romans called the Fates Parcae, or Parcae, P-A-R-C-A-E, don't know, which is a word connected with the Latin verb pare, P-A-R-E-R-E, meaning to bring forth, and so links the sisters with man's birth and life. The individual Latin names of the three sisters were Nona, Decima, and Morta. The first two presided over different months of birth. The names connect with words meaning 9 and 10, and the last ruled death. In spite of the widespread separation of the various Indo-European peoples and of such changes in their speech as to make one foreign to the other, the Greeks, Romans, and Northwest Europeans have individually retained the basic ideas concerning the fates. It is evident that the conception of the three fates goes back to Indo-European times, and that the ancestress of Wyrd, the Norns, the Parcae, and the Moirai were three all-powerful figures of at least 6,000 years ago. It is instructive to draw up a chart by which we can see at a glance the information in each source concerning the three fates. There's a chart now, right? Here's a chart which you can't see. How am I getting right? So it goes Greek, Roman, Old Norse, Old English, Shakespeare, and Holinshed. So number, I can't be bothered to. That's going to be too complicated to read. I'll try and get it a bit more. I'll try and take a picture of that and put it as the. Oh no, I can't be bothered. It's fine. So basically, Greek, Roman, Old Norse, Old English, Shakespeare, and Holinshed all use information about the three fates, these women. So, their collective names in Greek were Moirai, in Roman Parcae, in Old Norse Nornir, we don't know about in Old English, Shakespeare and Holinshed Wyrd sisters. They've got individual names. They all were spinners in all of them. Their real work was controlling men's fates. They lived in Greek and Old Norse by a cave, well and tree, and in Shakespeare and Holinshed, cavern and cauldron. Origin, Greek said they were daughters of night, we don't know in Roman, Old Norse or Old English. Shakespeare and Holinshed say secret black and midnight hags, creatures of the elder world, goddesses of destiny. Okay, there's a lot of basically similarities between Greek, Roman, Old Norse, Old English, and the Shakespeare stories. I think that's what it's trying to get at. We see that because all the other sources except the Old English have three fates, well, they don't know, including Shakespeare and Holinshed, who are reproducing, I am in pain, an Old English tradition not now extant in Anglo-Saxon. Our forefathers must have known about three fates. Their collective name has been lost to English tradition, and apart from Wyrd, or Wyrd, so have their individual names. On the analogy of Old Norse, the two sisters of Wyrd ought to be called Weothrend and Skuld, but there is no evidence to support such a conclusion. However, I would venture to suggest that the middle sister's name may have been known to the Anglo-Saxons as Metod, M-E-T-O-D, or Metod. This is a word found only as a synonym of the Christian God in extant writings, and is taken to be a masculine noun, but this is no real bar to my suggestion. The usual translation of metod is creator, yet its literal meaning is measurer, the word being connected with the modern verb to mete out. There is at least a suspicion that metod was a pagan name for one of the fates, the one who measured out the thread of life, the name being later translated to the Christian God. And then he's got a little side note. Since writing this, I find that Bosworth in his Anglo-Saxon and English Dictionary, London 1888, page 165, under the entry metan, M-E-T-A-M, gives support to my contention. Although evidence of the origin and abode of Wyrd and her sisters is lacking in Old English, nevertheless the evidence of Greek, Old Norse and Elizabethan sources confirms the connection of the fates with a cavern, a well and night. From this we may go on to ask, what were they? What was their essence? What were they an emblem of? It is pretty conclusive that three all-powerful sisters, daughters of night, who lived in a cave by a round white well and whose names were associated with the division of time, had much in common with the phases of the moon, crescent, full and waning, especially the phases of the moon as an ancient measure of time. That same moon which gave its name to one of the northwest European peoples' units of time, which we will still call month. The importance of this identification cannot be exaggerated, for, as we shall see, it affords an explanation of what to us appears inexplicable, namely, that the Old English should have regarded the all-powerful God as being subject to fate. But before seeking this explanation, we ought to answer the question, who was God? It's getting good, this, isn't it? The next one is, who was God? So that was Wyrd. Haha. W-Y-R-D. I'll go and have a little break now.